Welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm Thomas V. Miras. This podcast is an offering to the Holy Family and, less importantly, a production of CatholicCulture.org. Hey everybody, welcome back. Today will be part 2 of my interview with James Matthew Wilson. We've been talking about his book, The Vision of the Soul, and in part 1, we talked about his argument for conservatism as fundamentally literary and aesthetic rather than primarily political movement. We talked about what he calls the 6 central insights of the Western tradition, the Christian Platonist tradition, having to do with man as an intellectual creature fitted to contemplate the truth, a truth which presents itself to him even before he actively begins to seek it. And we've started to discuss beauty as central to the vision of the soul. In this episode, we'll be talking more about beauty as a property of being. It is in the nature of being to reveal itself to us, and in the natural plane of things, it does so preeminently through beauty. A crucial aspect of beauty is proportion, because when we experience beauty, we perceive a shining forth of a thing in all of its relations, the relations of its parts to each other and to the whole, but also the relation of the whole object to everything else that exists, to the whole of what exists, and to its maker, God. Before starting the interview, let me just note that I was originally going to put this interview out in 2 parts, but because today's segment is a little bit more philosophically challenging, perhaps, I decided to cut this out as its own episode. So instead of 2 episodes, the interview with James will be divided into 3, and so you'll get the final part next week. Also, I'd just like to acknowledge that for most of this episode, the sound quality on my voice is not as good as usual. That's something I had to mention back in episode 60 as well, because around the time that I recorded that and this and the next episode, I was having some issues with the app that I normally was using to record things and had to just resort to using Skype, which didn't come out with as high quality of a recording. So it'll be that way, unfortunately, on this episode and the next one, and then after that, it'll be back to normal. So I apologize for that. All right, let's get started. James, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Tom. Glad to be here again.
We concluded our previous conversation by touching on the difference between reason and intellect, more broadly speaking. And I think this is going to be something that we will need to explain a little bit more at some point during the interview. I don't know when the best place to talk about that would be.
Well, by coincidence, into my mind this morning popped the thoughts of Freud and Emerson. And you remember Freud authored a book, Civilization and Its Discontents. And I think Emerson has some aphorism that's sort of an anticipation of Freud about civilizing ourselves to death. I think what they have in common is that both Freud and Emerson seem to have thought of civilization as this working out of the reason, where the human intellect gradually methodizes and disillusions and disenchants everything so that we see it clearly. But as we come to see it clearly, it's so much less than we had once thought it was. So that to know the truth is to discover that there's nothing actually worth knowing. To have rationalized the world will in fact be to have completed the Cartesian project of disengaging everything genuinely human and worth loving from the world, so that all that's left are the kind of bare, stony facts that the psychologist or the capitalist or the scientist has uncovered and reduced to rubble, or at least revealed as rubble. That's a vision of the human being as a rational animal who's born for tragedy. The more you know, the worse life gets. So we can civilize ourselves to death just the opposite of what Jacques Maritain says. And I think we may have even mentioned this quotation of his in the last podcast, but Maritain says to civilize is to spiritualize. That it's, in fact, the act of discovering the transcendent richness of reality for which reason was born. And so there's no possible tragedy of reason, because reason proceeds from form to form, from truth to truth, until it arrives at the truth itself. I think those are the two choices that modern people usually think themselves as confronting, between a reason that disenchants or a reason that goes, up the river into the heart of darkest Africa and says with Joseph Conrad, the horror, or reason that with Socrates or with Plato's philosopher journeys out of the cave, which has a brightness to it, a fire to it, but out of the cave into a brightness infinitely more transcendent, the light of the sun. At the heart of the vision of the soul is the desire to recover this sense of life as a spiritual journey and a civilizing journey, where the eyes of the soul are at last made adequate to see what they most desire, and not to lose heart in thinking that the journey of the intellect is somehow this miserable tragedy where we ourselves are the author of our own disenchantment.
An observation that I've made over the years, I think, and reading your book sort of clarified what's going on for me, is that I think that even a lot of Catholic intellectuals who believe that there is such a thing as truth outside of ourselves are very informed by rationalism in the way that they conceive of the intellectual life and the contemplative life, in elevating sort of discursive reason and reasoning with words as almost the highest function of the intellect.
So there's definitely a neo-Thomist or a modern Catholic tendency to a kind of rationalism. And that neo-Thomist tendency to rationalism, it has a reasonable foundation or origin that we wouldn't want to simply discard, but it led to some problems. The origin lies, among other places, in the majesty and poverty of metaphysics, which is the first chapter in Jacques Maritain's great book, The Degrees of Knowledge. There, in those opening pages, he looks at the great modern philosophers, both Protestant and Catholic. Among the Catholics, Maurice Blondel with his action philosophy. And he says, all these modern thinkers have one thing in common, which is their unwillingness to forgive human reason for being abstract. Human reason begins in first principles that are immediate, and when we have a fullness of truth, we transcend the discursive, the abstract, and just see the truth in its fullness. But the middle way, the way of the pilgrimage to knowledge that is properly human, entails a great deal of the use of abstraction and the use of a discursive reason that puts abstract concepts or ideas into relationship with one another in forms of logic and in other ways. And so this faltering gait of saying 2 + 2 = 4, it has to occur at the level of abstraction, at the level of abstract logic, and it lacks the kind of visceral sense of a fullness of experience, a fullness of existence that we really crave when we desire to know the truth, when we desire to see it. But Maritain's argument is that, however untantalizing it may be, the use of abstraction, the use of the discursive reason, does lead us towards a fullness of truth. And for the human person, it's really our only way of moving in that direction. And so we have to respect the limitations and the lack, again, of this kind of existential richness that occurs when we're engaged in discursive reason. It's a lack of richness that the ancient world was totally aware of and comfortable with. Plato and Aristotle understood that you have to progress by way of discourse toward that full intellectual vision of the truth that the human being by nature is ordered to and desires most deeply with the most profound of erotic drives. So Maritain was right to defend discursive reason and abstraction as necessary for the human person and something that can't be avoided, even as we're journeying towards something that transcends it. But there was another side to the early 20th century Thomist revival and Catholic thinking that emerged from it that came to kind of rest all too contented with a kind of abstract reasoning, so that it began to think that if you just have the right syllogism, you've got everything you need for a full understanding of the truth. And I think Maritain and his great teacher, Garrigou Lagrange, can't really be said to be guilty of that. But there was something in the air in their day that led others, maybe lesser minds, to be such victims. And so we need to actually step back. We have to be grateful for the defense of discursive reason that Neo-Thomism afforded us. But we have to step back and recognize that discursive reason, whose end is truth, has also for its end not just the truth of a statement or the truth of a proposition, but the fullness of truth that we really see. And in order to really do justice to that fullness of vision, we have to introduce not just truth, but we have to introduce the word being, and we have to introduce its other properties, goodness and beauty as well.
I remember when I was a freshman at Christendom College and involved in the debate society, which was relatively new at the time. There was a debate on, I can't remember what the proposition being debated was, but it was essentially about knowledge versus love of God as our final end. And of course, the answer is that in their fullest form, they're identical. We know by loving. And it seems that the transcendental, which introduces to that way of knowing here on earth, would be beauty. That property of being, that property of God's love, is the one that initiates us into the ways of knowing without having to resort to words.
That's entirely true. And in fact, you don't even have to step outside of Aquinas. In fact, you don't even have to step outside of the Summa Theologica in order to show that to be the case. The various discussions that Aquinas gives us of beauty, he'll point out, on the one hand, beauty, like truth, is rooted in the form, the essence, the intelligible core and secret of things. On the other hand, beauty speaks to us of delight and of love and desire, and it speaks to us also of, therefore, the satisfaction of an appetite. So beauty is in that respect a kind of good. The way historians of philosophy have tended to resolve this question is to say that Aquinas believes that beauty is a kind of secondary transcendental, that the reason is ordered to the perception of being as truth, and that the will is ordered to the perception or appetition of being as good, and that beauty stands somewhere in back of these things, where we realize that to know the truth is good, or that what is genuinely good is by definition necessarily true. And so beauty sort of is kicked 2 rows, or at least 1 row behind truth and goodness and 2 rows behind being. Maritain, with what basis nobody really knows, said in a flourish of, I suppose, just good French rhetoric in a footnote to art and scholasticism, in truth, beauty is the synthesis of all the transcendentals combined. In one sense, that feels like empty rhetoric, because if beauty is a transcendental property of being, then how can a transcendental property of being be a synthesis of all the transcendentals? There's something not quite right there. But in another way, I think he is right. And in fact, we may have even talked about this the last time, that beauty gives itself to us first as the capacity of existent form to disclose itself, to share itself with another, which I think is really one of the most important things that we can know. So beauty is what von Balthasar called the primal phenomenon. You can't get at being without this first encounter with beauty. That may sound counterintuitive because we tend to think, oh, you encounter something and then you judge it beautiful. Well, there's some truth there, but beauty as a property of being is this particular capacity of existent form to disclose itself. And so beauty is what strikes us first. But as we enter into the being that first gives itself to us in its beauty, we discover what it is, we discover its truth, we discover what it's good for, its goodness, and then we discover that truth stands within a myriad whole of truth, for the truth of all things is one. There's a universal truth. And the whole of reality is ordered by this orderly progression of desires that Dante summed up for us with that great final phrase of the final line of the Divine Comedy, the love that moves the sun and the other stars. When we see truth and goodness whole, we discover that beauty wasn't just our first encounter with them. Beauty is actually the fullness of our encounter with them as well. So Maritain was finally right, though he may not have quite known why, that beauty really is the transcendental property that holds the other transcendentals together. Beauty is the fullness of truth and the fullness of goodness, fully reconciled to our sight within being.
I might have mentioned this quote from Nietzsche before, but I'm struck by it again here, where he says, "When power becomes gracious and descends into the visible, such descent I call beauty," which kind of reaffirms the connection between beauty and love in the form of mercy. I'm thinking now of Christ telling Saint Faustina that mercy is the greatest of his attributes. And it's interesting to see how in presenting itself to us, beauty sort of takes on the form of mercy.
Yes. So let me think back to your debate at Christendom for just half a second. The classic discussion is that, among Catholics anyhow, is that Aquinas is this great intellectualist who emphasizes the root of the soul as the specific difference of the soul is its intellection. And so it would be absurd for Aquinas to say that we love God but don't know him, because everything we are is founded in our capacity to enter in relationship through things, with things, through knowledge. And then Bonaventure, the great Franciscan, is considered the opposite. He's fully effective, and in the Itinerarium, love transcends knowing. And as you said, the true Thomist doctrine, and I think the true doctrine for the church as a whole, in fact, it's in your Penny Catechism, will say that we must know and love God. And in fact, we only know fully when we love, and we only love fully when we know. So those things are finally inseparable. What Nietzsche is doing there, on the one hand, as you suggest, is he's really on the cusp of a great Christian mystery. The mystery of beauty is that it gives itself to us. And in fact, the mystery of reality is that it gives itself to us. A lot of the modern philosophers who are so afraid of abstraction are afraid of it precisely because they don't want to lose sight of or lose contact with that crazy sensation of the mystery that things should exist rather than not. Being is strangely visceral. Being is strangely experiential in its throwing itself at us and allowing us to perceive it and to enter into relationship with it. What's fascinating about that quotation from Nietzsche is that power gives itself away as beauty, that what he saw as the dark secret of reality, that kind of surging, molten, protoplasmic movement of power to take on form and then disappear again, to give itself and then disappear, that he was not immune to the attraction and the wonder that being has just by appearing. And that really is, among other things, what beauty means.
Well, that should lead us to an important part of part 2 of your book, which, because some moderns have sort of thrown away the idea of beauty entirely, and there are other modern thinkers who have been, more or less nihilistic in many ways, but still have hung on because of a personal sensitivity to beauty and have tried to kind of come up with some explanation of how it relates or doesn't relate to reality. Adorno is a great example of that, because for him, what's the phrase that you quote him as? Only what does not fit into this world is true. So he has this idea that beauty, it does relate truth, and yet it's somehow radically disconnected from the reality we experience every day.
Yeah, Adorno joins, unsurprisingly, Emerson and Freud as not only seeing rationality as tragic, he sees the activity of reason entirely, top to bottom, an act of domination and the reduction of a living fullness of things to their abstract cash value.
It's all ideology, right?
It's all ideology. And behind his thinking, of course, is more than Nietzsche and Freud, is Marx. So he has a real sense that rationality is connected with a kind of what people like Alan Tate and John Crowe Ransom used to call the cash nexus, the reduction of everything to its market value. And so that simultaneously makes him a more and a less interesting thinker than somebody like Nietzsche. But what Adorno captures in that phrase that you just offered as just title of one of the chapters in Vision of the Soul is that beauty, any encounter with beauty, is in his mind an encounter with a non-rational and pre-rational encounter with the living fullness of reality, which is always necessarily an encounter with suffering, because what you're perceiving there is specifically what has been repressed by the world of rationality and the logic of exchange. I find Adorno a rich thinker for several reasons. We live in a day where beauty is routinely dismissed as ideology. I mean, the Marxists did it of old, but they continue to do it to this day, even though they've lost, almost everything else about Marx in their thinking. And Adorno is a great counter witness to them, saying we have here a darkly jaded Western Marxist thinker who sees so much of the world as ideology, but he looks at not beauty as an abstraction. He does dismiss the trinity of the transcendentals, truth, goodness, and beauty, as a mere truism or a kind of ideological sentimentality. But he insists all the more so that the experience of beauty may be, as it were, the one experience you have of truth living in this world of suffering, where everything that's shut out of our impoverished everyday life comes rushing back and is able to articulate some kind of primordial cry once again. So I don't think his account of beauty is satisfactory. It's not adequate, but it does establish something, whether on the left or the right, whether a Catholic or an atheist. If you ignore the primordial phenomenon of beauty, you're participating in barbarism and you're participating in untruth. And Adorno doesn't let a certain segment of our population forget that as much as they would like to.
So we should probably go on to talk about beauty in more detail. The three, I don't know if you'd call them criteria of beauty, or the three properties of beauty given by Aquinas. Those are radiance, proportion, and, oh gosh, what's the other one?
Integrity.
Integrity, yes.
Yeah.
And you have a discussion of all three of those, but you especially privilege proportion as being really fundamental to our experience of beauty.
Yeah, it's a good sign that if you ask a Catholic, what are the elements or conditions of beauty, he's likely to repeat that Trinitarian formulation that Aquinas gives us once and only once early in the Summa: integrity, proportion, and clarity. That's the only time, to my knowledge, that this tripartite formulation appears, not just in Aquinas, but in the early tradition. Although it's totally possible I'm mistaken, because in Bonaventure and others, there's a clear perception of how Trinitarian beauty indeed is. But leaving that aside for a moment, the more venerable definitions of beauty tend to have two parts rather than three parts. They'll say form and splendor, or the splendor of form, the splendor of truth, the splendor of order. What Aquinas does with his three-part or tripartite definition of beauty is actually helps us understand the two-part. Something's beautiful when it manifests a particular formedness, when we see an internal, intrinsic order to that thing. Well, what's that mean, an intrinsic order to that thing? Well, this reality, however small, or indeed even however lacking in parts, because it might be an absolute unity like an idea, must have a sense of being what it is, of being a unity, and of being a wholeness, of being a form. And this Aquinas describes as the integrity of a thing. But what the integrity of a thing, the unity of a thing, speaks of it being, in some sense, internally proportioned to itself, of being perfectly formed or whole. Wholeness, after all, is a kind of proportion. But then in that two-part version of definition of beauty, form and splendor, we get this splendor, and this will be more familiar to most people. The way in which some particular form specified, rendered totally visible to us on the canvas, or in the shape of a building, or in the fullness of a poem or a symphony, the way in which it kind of tends to irradiate, to reveal depths that are hidden within itself and a light that transcends it. And so we all know that the beautiful is mysterious because this one particular form gives forth a kind of splendor that seems necessarily more than the form itself, more than the sum of the parts. What Aquinas did by giving us this three-part definition of beauty is he says, indeed, form and splendor, or in his language, integrity and clarity, are two kinds of proportion among others that get revealed to us in beauty as a property of being. There's a proportion of a thing to itself, its integrity. There's a proportion of a thing to other things that are in some sense fundamentally related to it, to the parts within a canvas of a painting, for instance, to the parts within an actual landscape. And then, of course, those more far-flung relations, the way in which this waterfall is related to other waterfalls or to mountains, mountains there in the scene or mountains you've never seen before, the way in which this particular action is beautiful, not just because, let's say in the case of a football game, not just because it was a good run by a running back, but because it falls within the whole of a complete strategy of a game, the staggering of so many passing plays and so many running plays, so that you see that nothing is ever by itself. It's always standing in relationship to a certain fittingness or proportion or ratio to other things.
But this is why some people might say we shouldn't hang paintings in art galleries. They should be in people's homes or whatever, right? I mean, that's an important recognition of that kind of proportion.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's not a merely Philistine question to say, would this painting look good in a drawing room, look well in a sitting room? But there's also, there's a kind of defense to be made of the museum in one sense. It's trying to allow the proportions of the painting to stand apart with clarity so that you can capture their integrity. But you're right, you're depriving it of certain proportions that it really could have. That's a wonderful instance because so many of us have prints of paintings that do hang in museums, but then they hang in just the right place on the wall in our home as well. The only limit is that the ultimate proportion is the way in which this particular thing as existing form stands in relationship to the divine creative intelligence that causes all things to be. And so claritas is the highest and last proportion. And it's a truly infinite proportion because it's the relation of this particular finite thing to the infinite mind of God. Some people will say, well, so what you're telling me is that something's the more beautiful, the more complex it is, the more it seems to stand in an infinite number of relations. Well, that's not necessarily the case because actually a particular form tends to be more beautiful if it has just the right number of proportions. And indeed, simple things often have a certain clarity of proportions that more complex, ornate things don't, which is why, for instance, so few people find Joyce's Ulysses beautiful because it's too complex. It's too hard to see the whole. Rather, something's beautiful when it has its own particular integrity so that you can see that it's a whole, when it stands in proportion to other finite things, so that we can see how the truth is one, being is one, and this particular thing stands as a worthy entrant into the whole of beings. And then finally, and most richly, when something really shows forth its status as an existent being that's a kind of vicar of God, a manifestation of his transcendent creative intelligence, then we really feel as if through this finite thing, we ourselves are entering into a clarity, a vision of the divine. And it's that we most hunger for in our encounter with beauty, because by nature, our intellects are perceiving particular forms and proceeding on this long discursive pilgrimage that we pray and hope will eventually bear fruit in a vision of being itself, of God.
There's a couple things I'd like to say about this, one of which will lead into a further discussion of proportion. First of all, in your book, you talk about Umberto Eco's critique of Maritain as having given short shrift to proportion in his discussion of these aspects of beauty. And I'm just thinking of Maritain's wonderful book, The Responsibility of the Artist, where he, in talking about how the end of art is the good of the work itself and not the maker or of human society or anything like that, his solution to that moral problem is to say, but the artist as a man has further responsibilities to virtue and to the society in which he lives, towards God and things like that. But there's another almost simpler way of putting it that perhaps he might have said if he had given more due to proportion, which is that actually the way that art affects its environment, for lack of a better term, is an aspect of its beauty because it never is purely isolated.
Yeah, Maritain was so rightly, I think, enchanted by the way in which the work of art could really give us, to use Hopkins' phrase, news of God, the way it could reveal the divine intelligence through its own formed finitude, that he was so enchanted by that he was especially attracted to works of art that actually were kind of indifferent to all their finite proportions, just so long as they stood forth as an intimation of the light of the divine beauty that transcended them. And so he even says in a book not quite as late as The Responsibility of the Artist, but in Creative Intuition, says that a lot of poetry and modern music has surrendered the beauty of the ear in order to get at an ontological beauty. I think that was a real false note in his philosophy. You could see why he was doing it. He was reacting against a vision of the fine arts that was entirely ornamental, entirely technical, and entirely academic, that just said, if the proportions of the work itself are properly rendered, then it must be beauty, and what more do you want?
Well, there's a whole line where he says, the pretty is not the beautiful, the charming is not the beautiful, etc. And also he wants to rightly point out that, in art, the ugly can be transmuted in various ways into serving the beautiful.
Yeah, and that's why actually we need to do something that he was unwilling to do, as you pointed out. We need to recover this sense of proportion as being at the very center of beauty. Because what we're talking about when we say that word proportion is perceptible relations. The way you can see this particular form not only as fully related or whole to itself, but as standing in intelligible or perceptible relations to other things. The corpse in the battlefield by itself might be hideous, and it will contain some element of horror and ugliness to it. But it also, in its very existence, stands in relationship to other things. And those things we're always going to find fascinating and beautiful. We could go through this a number of ways. When we're thinking anatomically, to see the corpse, though the corpse lacks so much that a human being, to be a full human being or to be a proper human being, requires, we can still see the wondrous intelligibility of the human body and its proportion to ourselves, we the living, who incidentally also have bodies. In the great works of art, the dead body or the wounded body is often figuratively and sometimes literally at the center of the canvas. I'm just thinking off the top of my head of that great statue of the dying Gaul that Seamus Heaney wrote a poem about. The Gaul, the barbarian warrior, laying down on his shield after he's received his death blow. It's one of the great works of statuary, up there with that somewhat more decadent production, the Laocoon, where Laocoon and his sons are being surrounded by serpents. This is a scene of horror, and it's meant to excite horror in you. It's also a scene of beauty. And by that, we don't mean, it has two parts beauty and one part horror. Rather, the horror of the situation is part of its beauty, because to perceive the beauty of anything is precisely to see how this thing is a whole in itself that relates to other things, to many other things, and finally to the whole of reality that's been created by God.
Well, it seems it's from that it sounds as though Maritain's insight about the way that an artist can transmute the ugly into the beautiful actually relies on proportion for how it works.
It does, but he was anxious to ignore proportion because what he was enchanted by was the way in which what seemed a disproportionate ugliness could nonetheless reveal mysteries beyond itself. And so in the age in which he was writing, this is just what the best elements of modernism as a whole were attempting. The best figures in modernism is they were seeing how distorted, how much of a violation of verisimilitude or surface imitation the aesthetic could attain without betraying itself as the aesthetic. How much of charm and prettiness beauty could surrender before beauty itself ceased to be beautiful. And you can understand why they would do that, again, because there were earlier accounts of the beautiful that really did reduce it to the pretty or the charming and to a very superficial vision of those things. But what I think everybody acknowledges got lost in modernism is the sense of form and splendor as both being legitimate modes of proportion that reveal beauty, and in fact, necessary elements that allow beauty to subsist. And so the best works of art will always be those that have an integrity to themselves, that we can see them as having a kind of visible intelligibility and integrity or wholeness to themselves, but that also radiate these lines of connection both to other finite things, whether it's to their surrounding or to aspects of human history and human experience, to which they become connected, to which they throw out a line, as it were. And then finally to the divine. And it's just, again, Maritain he was so entranced by the mystery of the infinite showing itself in the particular that he was less interested or even willing to cast over entirely any attention to those more mundane, finite proportions that nonetheless have as much right to be an integral part of beauty as Claritas does.
The other observation I wanted to make is going back to Aquinas' other definition of beauty, which has vexed many. He says beauty is that which being seen pleases. And one of the insights I took from your book is how that itself also relates to proportion. If we're to see it as something other than a subjectivism or a kind of purely sensory experience of pleasure, I think another kind of proportion that it's important to attend to is the way, and this ties back into what you were saying earlier in this episode and in the previous discussion, the way in which reality is actually fitted to us and the way it's actually proportioned to our intellects.
Yeah, that's another aspect, I think, of the limitation, but also the riches of Maritain's account of beauty. He offers in a footnote a statement that is kind of contemptuous of our demand that the beautiful thing be proportioned to our intellects. And his reasoning is easy to find. If you ask Aquinas, is God intelligible? Is he knowable? Aquinas would, of course, say, not only is God knowable, he's the most knowable thing that is. He is pure intelligibility.
Yeah.
But then you ask him, but can we know him? And he say, well, okay, so he's the first knowable thing, absolutely, or objectively, as it were. But subjectively, he is in a very real sense the least knowable thing for us, or the last knowable thing. We have to do a whole lot of discursive labor to come even to a knowledge of God as being itself. We have to be able to think things through, and God is sort of the destiny of that journey for us, says Aquinas. So there's what's first absolutely, but what's also first for us. When Maritain talks about beauty, he's so enraptured by beauty as the absolute light of God that he's less sympathetic to those works of art that would condescend to to being first for us. That is to say, readily intelligible and perceptible for us. My big argument within fine art is to say, well, what we really want is a work of art that's beautiful in the sense that it's as perfectly proportioned as possible to the divine light of the creative intelligence, but also proportioned to we poor human creatures who have a receptive intelligence, so that we simultaneously can experience overwhelming light and not be totally rendered blind by it.
Is this modern aspect, this modern emphasis in Maritain and others on the sort of absolute aspects of the work itself, is this why you later in the book refer to modernism, somewhat surprisingly to me, as being sort of a metaphysically realist movement?
That's right.
Modernism in art, not in, Catholic theology.
Yeah, the way I'd put it is modernism in art, right, is the 19th century made pretenses of being realistic, but what they meant by realism, and this is something Maritain's very perceptive on, what they meant by realism was a superficial replication of the surfaces of things because they assumed that things have no depth. But everything has depth, whether it's a paperclip or a blade of grass, much less a human person. And therefore, 19th century realism fails by not being nearly realistic enough. You have to be willing to enter into the depths and the mystery of being in order to really perceive the real, to encounter the real, to encounter being. And so a lot of modernist works do it, but they do it in a kind of irritating way, as in, you look at a Rothko painting, just to give an example, and you say, well, what is it? I don't know, says your friend. And then somebody else chimes in, well, it must be some kind of, showing forth of the light of the mystery of being. And everybody nods their head. Yeah, I guess that's it. The surface is so banal that it must be concealing some kind of depth to it. And a lot of the time that's the case. The modernists were really experimenting to see how far they could go in neglecting surfaces to get at depth, precisely because they were reacting against an age that had tried to perfect surfaces, but was totally negligent of the depths of being.
That sounds very sympathetic to me. That's a very sympathetic way of casting them.
Well, there's another way of casting them, which is that, yeah, they were after the depth, but the depth they were after was not the depth of being, but the depth of psychology. And in fact, that is a part of modernism, so that modernism becomes pure self-expression, pure subjective emanation. And at which point, you might as well just chuck the whole thing. If art ever becomes about self-expression, that it's just not worth doing.
I'm going to close the episode with that excellent observation on modern art by James Matthew Wilson. As I said, there will be one more part to the interview, and in that one we'll talk about the importance of storytelling and mythos, and how modernity has rejected story as an approach to truth. This podcast is a user-supported production, so if you like what you hear, please consider giving us a donation at catholicculture.org/donate/audio. That is tax deductible, by the way. Also, we have two other great podcasts that I would love for you to check out. One is Catholic Culture Audiobooks. We've got a steadily increasing library of free, high-quality audiobooks of works by the Church Fathers, St. John Henry Newman, and other authors, read by voice actor James T. Majewski. And he's recently put out our first production of St. Augustine, a letter to a friend named Januarius. And also, he's begun a great classic of Christian biography, which is St. Athanasius' biography of St. Anthony of the Desert. This is a work that has inspired countless monks and saints. It even helped to inspire St. Augustine's conversion. So highly recommend checking that out. We've also got Way of the Fathers with Mike Aquilino, which is an excellent scripted history podcast on the Church Fathers. There's really nothing else out there like it. And by the way, if you enjoy this material, please share it with your friends, because we want to get the Church Fathers out to as many Catholics and non-Catholics, frankly, as possible. All right, so I'll see you next week with part 3 of The Vision of the Soul with James Matthew Wilson. Thanks for listening.